Every year. This is part of Residence Fellows Postdoc Research Day, so glad to have you here. And I'm wearing my Sheriff Rick hat because this is truly a responsible conduct of research session. And today it's great to have Dr. Worley and Lisa Hobel-Heinrich present a presentation on conflict of interest. So for Lisa Hobel-Heinrich, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, it makes sense for her to be talking about this. Why Dr. Worley? Why is Dr. Worley? Oh, I didn't turn it on. Thank you. So Dr. Worley wears many hats at KU Medical Center. He said he forgot to bring his cowboy hat today, but trust me, he wears many hats, and currently he's the dean of our graduate education program in the School of Medicine. In addition to that, and I didn't realize this, Mike, until we started arranging this program this year, he's the head of the Conflict of Interest Committee. So that's another important hat he wears, and that's why he's here as part of the Conflict of Interest presentation. So thanks, Dr. Worley, for wearing that additional hat for the KU Medical Center. Lisa Hobel-Heinrich is an attorney who I've worked with now for a number of years, since I've been Vice Chancellor of Research, and she is currently the Associate Vice Chancellor and Chief Compliance Officer for the university. And she's a true expert in the field of conflict of interest. Lisa had been in the General Counsel office at KU, first in Lawrence and then here on the Medical Center side, before she moved over to take over as Associate Vice Chancellor in charge of compliance at the Medical Center. And Lisa is, and all the attorneys up there in the General Counsel office, in HR, in the RI, have really taught me that lawyers really can be your best friends. And at KU Medical Center, our lawyers really are our best friends, even though she constantly reminds me every day that she doesn't practice law anymore. She's a compliance officer, but still seems like law to me. So I don't know who's gonna go first. Mike, Lisa? Okay, so welcome Lisa and Mike. Thank you. And I've already deputized them for our pictures, so there we go. All right.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. I want to start out by saying that Dr. Worley and I have no actual or potential conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation, although I think you'll find that I do have some opinions, which I will share with you as we go forward. I wanted to start out by maybe just as a reminder, revisiting some simple definitions of what a conflict of interest is, both an individual conflict of interest and an institutional conflict of interest. I thought the best way to do that would be to review two definitions that you should be familiar with. The first is the Kansas Board of Regents policy on commitment of time, conflict of interest, consulting, and other employment. And that definition is a divergence between an individual's private, personal relationships or interests and his or her professional obligations, such that an independent observer, not the researcher or faculty member or individual themselves, might reasonably question whether the individual's professional actions or decisions are determined or substantially influenced by considerations of personal benefit, gain, or advantage. KU Medical Center's conflict of interest policy takes that further because of federal research regulations that we are required to comply with, and has a definition of individual conflict of interest that describes a significant financial interest that KUMC reasonably determines compromises or has the appearance of compromising the fulfillment of professional duties. In the case of research, this includes a significant financial interest that KUMC reasonably determines could directly and significantly affect the design, conduct, or reporting of KUMC research. So they appear to be pretty simple definitions. I'm sure there's some terms in there that jump out at you. For example, what does it mean to directly and significantly affect the design? How do we define design, conduct, or reporting of research? That's something we'll talk about a little bit later. But those are the general concepts. When we're talking about institutional conflict of interest, we're talking about something different. And KUMC's policy on management of institutional conflicts of interest says, a situation in which the financial interests of an institution or a university official acting within his or her authority on behalf of the institution may affect or appear to affect the research, education, clinical, business transactions, or other activities of the institution. So in that case, we're talking about situations where, for example, the university itself may have equity in an outside company or may have received as an institution a gift, say, from a pharmaceutical company or other entity that it may do business with. Or it could be a situation where we have someone in a position of leadership who has the ability to influence institutional decisions, maybe the research agenda of the institution, that has an outside relationship with an entity where they may be able to make decisions as to business arrangements with that entity that they have that relationship with. So that's what we mean by institutional conflict of interest. So, I know for many of you this is an incredibly confusing area, and I just want to reassure you that is because it is a very confusing area. And when you look at the policy and regulatory landscape that we're faced with, you see that on first read, some of these definitions seem relatively simple, but there are all different types of policies, definitions, requirements that apply in this area. I mentioned earlier our own example of the University and Board of Regents conflict of interest time policies. We also, as many public institutions do, have state ethics statutes that, if you are a state employee, apply to your relationships with outside entities that you have a relationship with. And in our case, we actually have separate reporting obligations directly to the state for certain categories of employees that we have. We've got licensing statutes for some of us, which as a definition of what they constitute as unprofessional conduct can include conflict of interest issues, accreditation requirements. In our case, we do have a human research protection program that is accredited, and it was because of that accreditation that we first put in place our institutional conflict of interest policy. For those of you who are clinicians or involved in activities that generate billing, federal and state healthcare programs, there are self-referral anti-kickback statutes that prohibit certain activity that has to do with self-referrals or compensation or remuneration that in some way may be tied to the volume or value of referrals. So we're having to think about those statutes sometimes. There's also journal policies, and the Institute of Medicine came out with a report in 2009, and we saw about 10 years ago, as a result of some high-profile things that occurred, journals starting to tighten up their conflict of interest policies, not necessarily consistently in terms of how they were defining them and the requirements they had for reporting. The Institute of Medicine report starting to pull together some best practices that institutions were starting to look at. And then in 2012, the PHS, Public Health Service, came out with revisions to the federal regulations, but of course those were separate from the FDA and they were not exactly the same as NSF. So that there was additional complexity involved there, as well as other federal policy requirements in grant funding contexts for procurement and so forth. So incredibly confusing. And perhaps the biggest change that occurred in 2013 was the establishment of the open payment system, which through federal statute required pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers, GPOs, group purchasing organizations to post publicly to provide information about payments made to physicians. And so if you are a physician, your information and the type of payment, say, that the pharmaceutical company is making to you and the category of that payment, consulting, other services, is being reported on that system. It is a system that is prone to error. And so providers are encouraged to go out and review their information. There's a deadline for when they can request revisions and corrections to their information, but that is publicly available information now. So as I think you can see from all of the different policies, regulatory requirements that we have, there are a number of challenges that the existing conflict of interest environment presents for individuals who are engaging in research. Inconsistent definitions and reporting thresholds depending on what entity or what regulation it is that we're talking about. Administrative burden caused by numerous entities requesting similar information, different journals, different entities, collaborating institutions. Lack of transparency caused by the collection of information in silos and lack of ability to share that information amongst institutions, and simple human error because those systems are fragmented. And so we may have investigators who are reporting something and then having to report it again with a slightly different definition or using a different form. So around the time of 2012, when the federal regulations were being revised, the AAMC took the opportunity, because we know when regulations are coming, there's a requirement for there to be proposed notice of those. They took the opportunity to collect baseline information from their member institutions, and 2 years after that, so that they could provide feedback to NIH and other agencies about the effectiveness of the implementation of those regulations. And their findings were very interesting. First, they found that the number of significant financial interests, meaning interests in that definition 5,000 or above, reviewed increased amongst the institutions that were involved in this study. The number of SFIs increased, but there was not a proportional increase in the number of reported financial conflicts of interest. What that means is reports increased, but those reports were not found to be conflicts of interest by the institution that would have required reporting to the federal agency. And so it was really the collection of information that didn't go anywhere, essentially. 79% reported an increase in disclosed significant financial interest, while 45% reported an increase in FCOI. So you can see it didn't increase proportionately. For those institutions that provided complete data, both on the disclosed SFIs and what was reported as a financial conflict of interest to the federal granting agency, the percentage of significant financial interest actually found to be a financial conflict of interest decreased after implementation of those regulations from 4.8 to 1.4. After implementation, they also pointed out that the personnel administering COI-related activities at the 71 institutions that reported increased from 1.9 FTEs to 2.7 FTEs. So they were pointing out that the administrative burden was nonetheless increasing. And so in their conclusion to the study that they reported was that when the cost of implementation is considered, there's a question as to whether the rule accomplished its intended goals and appropriately balanced the benefits and burdens of the requirements. It's worth considering whether the objectivity of research is better ensured because of these changes, and whether the incremental increase in the number of reported and managed FCOIs had tangible effect on the research enterprise as a whole. So really raising some serious questions about the implementation of those regulations. Meanwhile, there was full steam ahead on a number of public transparency activities, initiatives that were generating a lot of attention nationally. One of the ones that a lot of medical colleges were paying attention to was the American Medical Student Association scorecard. And that group was requesting, and if they didn't get them, scouring websites and finding them in other ways, requesting this conflict of interest policies for medical schools across the country. They were evaluating those policies across various different categories or domains of those policies. For example, looking at their threshold reporting requirements, whether they had provisions prohibiting vendors from being on campus, the stringency of their gift requirements, what kind of conflict of interest education they were providing to their students, and then they would publish a national scorecard. where they would rank institutions against each other. And that had direct effects on institutions and changes and revisions to their policies over time. Just recently, they posted on their website that they have transitioned their focus from medical schools to Congress. So they're now going to be looking at information about political contributions and things like that. And so I haven't seen the details on what that's going to be, but they're now indicating they're going to change their focus. You also may have heard about the public transparency initiative of ProPublica. It was called Dollars for Docs. That got a lot of attention nationwide, including the Kansas City Star, that reported on local physicians who were listed. That's a database that contains data from payment reports that I showed you from the open payment system that is coming from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It ranks doctors to allow comparison amongst their peers based on specialty and other information. If you look at that information, you'll see that Kansas is listed as 34th among the states for the amount of payments received between August 13 and December 2016. And they've got a lot of information there for consumers. And what they're doing in a nutshell is taking the CMS data and making it much more user-friendly so that people can easily be searching on that website. And I took just a sample of screenshots and show them here so that you can see how easy it is to get this information. And you'll see that they have a nice search box up on top. And you can also see, this was right on the front of the website when you hit on Kansas, it's listing the top physician and the top institution. What I think is interesting to mention here is that this is not necessarily intuitive information for consumers. If you drill down on this information, you would know that the person who is listed there on the top, that money is not from consulting, that compensation was from royalties. But that's not immediately apparent to a consumer who is looking at that. I believe the second person that you saw there was the subject of some lengthy Kansas City Star articles about a pain clinic. And so those are really interesting articles if you haven't seen those. Okay. And so there you see, these are just a sample of the articles. They have a whole series on their website where they, in partnership with the New York Times, is tracking this and now using Part D data as well to provide more information, more search capability. The other thing that we're seeing is movement and discussion towards a global disclosure system. And I mentioned earlier how complex it is for investigators and researchers with different reporting requirements, different reporting portals, and different requirements for different journals, for example. And so coming out of that metrics project that AAMC did with the implementation of the federal regs, they, in partnership with some others, started development of a system called Convey. And that system was intended to be a web-based repository that would allow, if you see here, investigators to go in, researchers put their information in one time, and then allow entities across the country to go in and access that information. I understand it is set up so that different institutions with different requirements can only pull the data that they need. And you see there that there was recently an article in the New York Times, a letter, opinion letter from the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine describing their involvement with this and encouraging others to jump on that bandwagon. And we'll come back to that. But this is something that is gaining some attention here. So I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Worley, who's going to talk about how conflicts are identified here, and then come back and
little bit of nuts and bolts or looking behind the curtain on how the committee works. And so one of the things that's nice with the Conflict of Interest Committee Harold Godwin did a great job. So Harold was the chair from it was born till when I took over, and they did a lot of heavy lifting to get it going, and I'll talk about the people who really do the heavy lifting on the committee. But I thought at first, it'd be good to talk about who's on the committee. And the first person on there is Worth Davis, and we had Sam Malsbury for a long time, but Sam was there for 17 years, I believe, or it was a very long time. He was also a community member. Worth Davis is now a community member. And remember, we talked about that initial definition where it has to be, something that looks good to a normal person or an outside person. Well, Sam's basically and Worth are those people that said, hey, wait a minute. Okay, and Worth's background is he was a pharmacist, so he understands drugs, he understands the drug companies, he understands the drug company reps coming and trying to, convince you to do things. So that's a really, really big thing. We really appreciate his time because it's volunteer. He comes in once a month and reviews all the materials beforehand, and the meeting goes pretty quick, but it's great to have community engagement like that. So I'm the chair, I'm in School of Medicine, and then Bill Barkman's the vice chair, and he's also in the School of Medicine. And then we have Carrie Ayler-Schmidt, she's down in Wichita, because we want to have the Wichita, because sometimes there's some information of what's going on in Wichita. She has a great handle on what's happening there. So you can see we're very distributed in the committee membership. We want somebody from all different facets to look at this. So Carrie calls in, it'd be quite a commute each month, but she calls in. Nancy Dunton, she's in the School of Nursing. James Backus, he's in the School of Pharmacy, and it's little known, at KUMC, a lot of times we just forget that the School of Pharmacy does have classes here. They have a big, big role in our campus. They're up on the 6th floor of Wesco, so if you want to go visit. So that's a good viewpoint also from the School of Pharmacy. Carrie Ciros from the School of Health Profession, and then Lisa, who's the compliance. And I'll echo what Rick said about lawyers. Lawyers are great when they got your back. Okay, if you're up against them, not so good. All right, so Lisa comes in and gives us, good advice on, well, you might not want to go there. All right, so those are the faculty there on the committee, but the real big heavy lifting is from Ryan and Kim, and they're over here. There's Ryan. So I very much appreciate their work, and we'll talk about how we found a lot of these conflicts. Ryan goes through, and when the ProPublica and the Open Records came out, basically he went through this massive database, because it's much better to have one of our people find this out than a reporter. So he went through the database and he found all of the people who had payments, and he compared it to all of the protocols to look to see if the payment from that company might overlap with the Venn diagram with that research. And then we went back and started playing a game of catch up. We'll just put it that way. But it was really good because we did get in front. And one of the common features that we want to say for the committee when we go through and we look at this is we basically do a smell test. We say, is this something that's right? This is something that if it got out and was on the Kansas City Star, we'd be able to say, hey, this is a good thing. Because when you get right down to it, conflicts are good. What are conflicts? I mean, to us, if we've got a PI who's doing something and the company is valuing very highly their expertise, and that person is interacting with the company or the industry to help lead treatments to get better cures for our patients, that is a good thing. So we need the PIs, the physicians, anyone who's receiving those funds to basically tell us about it. It will come to our committee and we will help you manage it. We will get your back so that, again, if the newspaper shows up, you can say, hey, the committee reviewed it, I'm good. All right. And so with all the experience we've had, and we can get through them very quickly. So, first off, what we want to try to do is get that culture change out there where people are declaring these up front in their IRBs, because it'll save them time, it'll save us time. So again, that's kind of going forward. And then the non-voting staff, we get very good support from all the people on the list here, where they basically will tell us, okay, even from IACUC standpoint, how could this research study and the animal protocol, how do we handle that sort of a conflict? So it's a pretty far-ranging committee, and it's a very good committee. A lot of learning goes on in that committee. We're always trying to figure out new things and how to, basically how to manage them. All right, so essentially there's a lot of different ways for things to end up at the COI office and the COI committee. This graph kind of is a good flow chart. Basically, we confirm that there's a conflict and that it's above certain thresholds. If this is self-reported, if you look down at the bottom with the little asterisk, if it's self-reported, we can get it to the committee really quickly, and then sometimes Bill and I can just do an administrative review and basically get it done in a few days. It depends on our schedules, but we do our best to get it done quickly. So there's a lot of different ways for it to come, but essentially if it goes through IRB and then it's ticked off because there's a something out there in the database and it's not listed, or if it is listed and we decide that this is important for this study, then it'll hold up the IRB and it goes to us for an ancillary review. All right. So again, the office, and this is Ryan and Kim, basically do a lot of sifting for us, a lot of sifting, and try to handle as much before it comes to the committee. Sometimes those meetings can run pretty long. We'll just put it that way. But again, that's fine. We'll manage those. All right. Again, we identify a potential conflict of interest, and now remember that the office always tells it as a potential. Then it comes to the committee, and the committee will then look at it and say, all right, this is something where we should probably look at it if it's a minimal risk, if it's something where it's like a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Bill and I will look at that and say, well, there's pretty much very minimal risk that the person running this study could do anything to influence the outcome of the study. So a lot of times we'll put that as like our consent agenda items. And so we'll not hold it up, not hold up IRB, but just basically say, yeah, go, we'll handle this. This is probably pretty low risk. And that's the expedited review by chairs. But then if it comes to the full committee, then basically we look at it, we read it, we look at all the different forms that are sent in, look at the consent form. There's a lot of background reading that goes on, learning about what it's about to try to get a good feel for, is it a significant conflict? And if it is a significant conflict, how are we going to manage it? How are we going to handle it? And I'll show you some of the, and then here's another, as far as this one, just there's an arrow. There's a lot of different steps here. But essentially what we try to do is get them through as quickly as possible. But again, if we have to manage it, that's fine. But if we have to report it, and when we do have to report it, that's because it's a federal study where we determine that there was a significant, basically conflict, and that conflict could impact the design or the carrying out of the study, then we have to report it up, and then that really raises the bar. Okay? Yeah.
So then on the box there, research-initiated COI certification or disclosures current, those are all the emails that we get on individual studies, and then we have to go in and say it's current or not. But that's happening late in the process, so I guess that's another place to be caught. But that's usually after your previous slide.
Correct.
IRB.
Correct. We have an incredibly difficult process to catch the conflicts beforehand, but the PIs, when they're submitting the forms, when they're doing things, I always joke and say, well, when you sign off on the form, you should put as much thought in signing off of the form as you do in signing off on that check. Okay, so we joke on the committee that the forms are correct or not correct. They're rarely correct. So Ryan's catching them, and we're having to come in after the fact.
Not this one,
but the one before. Yep, we're catching them beforehand. So if people were putting the conflicts in up front, wow, it goes way faster. And it's much, much less work for them and grief and for us. So again, when I'm saying that conflict is good, we want to get that culture change. We want people putting down all the conflicts. And so for a lot of times, if it's a co-investigator and they don't enter that into the system, you're not going to know what your co-investigator's getting, from a company. All right? You may not ask them. You may not know, especially on some of the cancer studies where we have how many people listed as co-investigators? About 200. All right. And so again, but then normally it happens as we go through, check the databases. Ryan does the little cross listing. We identify it, and then after it's been approved, we have to come back and clean it up, and that takes longer.
Go back to So you're talking about the form that you fill out.
Yep. Basically, we identify this here at the very beginning, okay? But when you fill out your IRB form, there's this, you've signed off on it.
No, I signed.
Yep.
That's the form where you want to catch this.
Yep.
Where the investigator would self-disclose.
Yep. Yep.
You've been a speaker or you're a consultant.
Yep. And then basically, essentially, in this one, you would go down at this bottom one, you go quickly to COI, we cover it, and it doesn't hold you up for a month or two. So, Peter.
So ideally, the first submission would have all the conflicts of the PI and the co-Is.
Yep.
If it doesn't, then it'll slow everything down later on.
And hopefully Ryan catches it and not ProPublica.
Yes.
Okay. And when we get to the horror story at the end, they're going to catch it. Okay. And so we're doing our best to get in front of it, and we spend a lot of time cleaning things up, and we catch them after the fact. But even the database is delayed. If you saw on the database, it's, what, a year and a half old data, Ryan? Pretty much. So we're catching a lot of things after the fact, which makes it much harder. But again, I would much rather have your first call be from us than from the Kansas City Star. Okay, so again, when I say Ryan does heavy lifting, he does. All right, and it's not that we're out there trying to play gotcha. All right, we're trying to say protect you, because again, this is something. When we get to the Sloan Kettering, it's people who didn't provide that information up front, and we know from all of those stories, and Lisa's going to talk about it, it's very easy to miss it. But the culture change's got to be, you better start declaring right away. Okay, and if you do, then we get it through as quick as possible. So once we get it, we review it. What we do, this is literally from our form. We have a checklist that we go through. So the first thing is, if there's a conflict, we think it's significant, we have, basically in the consent form, we put language to tell the person who is deciding whether or not to be in the study, they have the right to know that this person on the study is receiving money for the study. And again, from my point of view, I think it's a good thing, because it tells me if I was a parent or a patient, I would want to know that the doctor in charge of the study is high in understanding that study. So that conflict is good. But we do put that language in the consent form. If it's an after the fact where we catch it, then you go back and they have to reconsent the patients, okay, because they need to know. It's a need to know basis. The second one is when we do recusal from study activities. Most often we do recuse the person who's conflicted from basically doing that consent. So we're not going to have them putting it in front of the patient and saying, sign here, please. Yeah, I get money, but it's no problem. So we say they cannot be in the room. In some cases, when there's not a lot of people on the study, we will allow them to answer questions, but then turn it over to someone else that goes through the form. Okay? So we just think that's a good practice, basically to present that to the patients in a neutral, way. Safety reporting and monitoring, that's the big one. What happens to the data? All right, what happens to the safety data? If we think that there's an inkling that the PI could be involved and needs some protection there, we'll check that box. But it's pretty rare that we check that box. We go through the study. Usually there's large enough groups that there's enough arm's length that we're fine. Public disclosures from presentations, journals, and CME, that's a permanently checked box. Okay, because if you've got a conflict and you don't disclose it when you publish it, that's going to catch like all the Sloan Kettering people. So we pretty much, that one's always checked, but we have it there anyways because we go through that process. Independent data and safety monitoring, again, so we basically, if we need something where we need somebody else monitoring the data or the safety. Divestiture of interest, this is one of my own personal, because I mean, there's one thing if you're paid by a company for your expertise. It's another thing for what I would call a self-inflicted wound, is where you go out and you purchase stock in the company that you're doing research on. So if we catch that one, you're going to basically probably get either thrown off the study or we're going to tell you to divest that interest, because there's tons of insider trading cases that happen because a doctor finds out, well, you know, maybe not from their part of the study, but on the call that they had from colleagues where, hey, this drug sucks, you know, and then they sell their stock. So there's been known cases of that coming up, and we just don't want the institution involved. You as an individual have the right to buy stock. You can do that, but we as an institution have the right to protect our name and say, you can't put our name on this study if you own stock in that company. Okay? So that's a big one. And then we can also, if we have an institutional conflict, say, well, we can't do it here, or basically an independent IRB if we need to kick it off to a different IRB. Peter.
Something that might be helpful, since I know we do have representatives of the hospital here, is that if one of these financial interests appears, there are very important steps that need to be taken at the hospital concerning their activity on formulary boards or other types of purchasing committees. And that's not our job, but it is a job that the hospital is probably very interested in making sure they're getting the information and acting on it. And that's an independent duty that is separate from being a researcher. It's your duty as a physician who might be serving on those types of boards at the hospital.
Yeah. And again, it's not a question of if, but when those keep bubbling up, because the AI and the databases, they're catching more and more and more. They went over Sloan Kettering after Sloan Kettering first, and the more they dig in, and again, we'll get to that real quick here. All right. Then the hardest part for us is when it's a PHS one. We have to determine whether the answers to these two questions, which is, again, to the definition, is it a significant financial interest? And usually it doesn't get to the committee unless it is. So most of the time that first question that you answer in that first box is going to be yes. But then the second question is, will that significant financial interest impact, and that's the design, where is it? The design, conduct, or reporting of the PHA-funded research. And that's one where we have to really get into the details and say, could this conflicted individual, did they have a say in how the study was designed? Did they have a say in how it was, the data's collected, how it would be reported, and would that could, not would, but could, in the smell test, could an impartial observer say, yeah, they're fudging this, or they're biasing the data, or they're cherry picking the data? Could they do it? Not did they do it, or is there evidence that they did it? But if you looked at this as an impartial observer, could they have done that? And that's the one that we spend most of our time going through, because if the answer is yes and yes, and this is an after the fact catch, wow. The amount of reporting that goes back to NIH and the impact is huge. So again, if this is before the fact and we can catch it and manage it earlier, much, 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 much better. Okay? All right, so that's kind of, background how we do it. But again, bottom line, what we really need is for people to start listing their conflicts and let us manage them quickly and efficiently. It'll be a lot better for them and for us going forward.
Thank you. And just to follow up on Peter's comment, we will, for example, if we have investigator who perhaps successfully commercialized something, who may be in a position to write a prescription for something that they may receive royalties on, we absolutely would be coordinating with the health system, get joint management plans in place, and that's a very important thing to be keeping in mind. Wanted to share with you some of the details about the Memorial Sloan Kettering story, because it really has informed over the past 6 months evolving standards in terms of how conflict of interest policies are being revised. Institutions across the country are taking a look at what they've been doing, revising their policies, and just a lot of attention being paid to what is coming out of that situation. In September 2018, it started when ProPublica and the New York Times ran a story involving Jose Baselga, who was the chief medical officer, I think physician-in-chief was his title, at Sloan Kettering. And they, just using publicly available information, published a story indicating that he had failed to disclose millions of dollars and outside relationships. He was on the board of Roche, I believe. He also was on the board of various biotech companies and had failed to disclose that. As I recall, the year that the prior year from the article, they said 87% of the publications that he was an author on, he did not disclose any conflicts of interest. There was quite a bit of internal gnashing of teeth at Sloan, and there were public statements issued both by him and by the institution, exhorting their faculty to do a better job of reporting, but also indicating that those kinds of industry relationships are important. Dr. Baselga said that while he had been an author on many tens of articles, only 17 would require updating. That lasted, I think, less than a week or so, and we then saw the next article where he was resigning. He was also resigned from the boards of Roche and some of the other entities that he had relationships with. It wasn't long, perhaps a week after that, that there was another bombshell article about Sloan Kettering having a cozy deal, they called it, with a startup igniting an uproar. And what happened there was there had been a group of individuals who, there was an artificial intelligence startup involving pathology, and they had entered into an exclusive contract with the outside entity, giving them exclusive access to 25 million slides, I think, pathology slides, collected over a period of, I recall it was about 60 years. Investors in that company included members of Sloan Kettering's board, the chair of pathology. I think another individual who was over a research lab had an investment or involvement in that company. They had not gotten a independent fair market evaluation of those assets, and there started to be dialogue or faculty expressing frustration with leadership, including some calls for a vote of no confidence. It was very shortly after that, I think on the 29th, where there was yet another article where an individual who was over their technology transfer operations or assisting with their outside venture development, who had been asked by the institution, was serving as a member on the board of an outside entity that went public, and he had been given options as compensation for that role. And when that went public, talk about very bad timing, because it was in about the week when all of that was occurring, went public, he then got a windfall of over $1 million. And he went to leadership, disclosed that. He divested himself of that. Nonetheless, created the next headline there. We then saw shortly after that their chief executive resigning from Merck's board of directors, so the stories continued. And then there continued to be internal meetings, reports that leadership was being asked to votes of no confidence, things like that going on internally. They issued some interim steps with regard to the what they would allow their leadership to do in terms of relationships with outside entities, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. They also brought in, I believe, 2 law firms to conduct an investigation, and one to do a survey benchmark of institutions across the country to determine what those best practices were and make some recommendations. And ultimately, you see there that last headline was the report finding that leaders had violated conflict of interest rules. So what's next? Well, what we've seen coming out of that and really increasing in intensity is discussion about best practices and what should the best practices be. And you can Google online, actually ProPublica has a convenient link right to it, what just recently in the last month Memorial Sloan Kettering issued as its principles going forward for how to handle this. And if you read that, it really, to me, reads as a compendium of best practices of what institutions across the country had already been talking about, but you see it pulled together all in one document very nicely. And to go through those, because like I said, from my perspective, it looks like things that all of us and our counterparts have been talking about, but you see it pulled together very comprehensively in this document. They talk about governance and oversight, formalizing at the leadership level, more direct oversight of the practices of the institution. I think at Sloan Kettering, they had taken their committee out of reviewing conflicts for their leadership. Initially, I think for reasons they thought were beneficial at the time because those individuals were in a position of reviewing conflicts for leadership, but they then didn't backfill to make sure that those were being appropriately reviewed in a different way. See a lot of more attention being paid to things like pre-employee pre-screening before people even get into the institution and putting in place requirements for that. Conflict of interest commitment issues with explicit thresholds. I think if you look at some of the activities that the individuals were involved in, it makes you wonder how they were eating and sleeping when you add up all the time that would have had to take to warrant the compensation that they were getting. So you see recommendations that if it is above a certain threshold, we're going to have an independent committee looking at that specifically. Also, recommendations about board and executive service. And, for example, the windfall situation that I talked to you about, they implemented a rule where they would not allow any of those individuals to have board membership on for-profit institutions in the life sciences area. They also said they would not assume when they have a situation like that where it's more of a spin-out situation that they would they would not presume that they would have a voting role on that, and any compensation that was provided for the service on the board at the request of the institution would come back to the institution. Now, public institutions like us have rules about additional compensation anyway, but that was not something that Sloan Kettering had put in place in advance. We also see a lot of discussion about disclosure, enhanced disclosure and transparency, and not just at Sloan Kettering. I've seen recent dialogue about others, Dana-Farber, Fred Hutch, talking about enhanced reporting and public transparency. One of the things that Memorial Sloan Kettering has said that it is going to look at is publicly posting all of the financial interest type of information of their physicians on the web. Now, that's something that some others had already gone to. Cleveland Clinic is one. I think there are some others, and Open Payment System changed the calculus a little bit, so at least for physicians who are part of that system, and quite a bit is already being posted, but you're now seeing institutions looking at perhaps posting things publicly on the website voluntarily. From the journal disclosure perspective, you may have seen in JAMA and some other places dialogue among or articles, letters to the editor about journal disclosure requirements, inconsistencies in policies, and trying to come together to bring more coordination. I think you also are seeing calls for when the journals see someone who has not followed their reporting policy to provide that information to their institutions and to the research misconduct officials there, and starting to take a look at this from a different perspective, which is research misconduct. And so I think it's likely that we may start to see more communication coming to our institution from the journals themselves when they see, because they now have a increased expectation of checking things like open payments on their end. Disclosure to institutional personnel and others involved in the research, and you know, in Sloan Kettering's case, you had situations where rank and file physicians were wondering why the head of pathology was allowed to have these interests in this outside company. And there had not been full disclosure of those types of relationships prior. And then quite a bit of discussion going on now about improved systems and expanded resources. And so you saw the New England Journal commentary about the use of Convey. And Memorial Sloan Kettering has also said that it is going to be looking at whether that is a system that may be useful for them. Finally, on the technology transfer side, you see increased attention to reviewing licensing agreements and licensing negotiations, so that when institutions are dealing with spin-ups, which may have interests of faculty members as or equity ownership of other individuals in leadership positions, making sure that information about that is not siloed off from other individuals who may have a need to know, and being more transparent. And then talking about research safeguards, particularly in the clinical context. Now, this is something that we have done here for quite some time, but it's garnering more attention, I think. And so we're talking about situations where, for example, a PI may have an interest with a sponsor, a relationship with a sponsor, and want to be PI on a study that sponsor is sponsoring at their institution. And so you might be seeing policies that say if it is over a certain dollar amount, unless there are compelling circumstances, we will presume that that research will not happen at this institution. And so seeing dialogue about what would those compelling circumstances be. Maybe there's specialized equipment or specialized expertise. Could be a rare disease, for example, where because of the specialized nature of what that institution does, that's where that patient population is, for example. But there's that's also something that Sloan Kettering in their in the published principles document has said that they're going to be taking a look at. And then things like standing committees, where when there are certain types of research activities going on, where there may have been identification of some potential conflict there or actual conflict, is bringing in committees of faculty members who have no relationship to that research to provide oversight as that research goes along. Now, I can say that's a traditional management type of plan, something that we have on occasion used here as well, but quite a bit of discussion about that. So across the board, you see a lot of attention about monitoring and auditing, because the burden now with regard to not just the publication of continued publication of ProPublica, Open Records, but with what's happened in some of these high-profile stories, we know that the expectation in terms of internal monitoring and so forth has the bar is risen here. So where does that leave us? I think a good a potential positive is that I think you see a lot of dialogue about trying to bring more consistency to definitions and reporting requirements, and that dialogue about convey and maybe a global system, and more attention being paid to what are those barriers to bring increased coordination and reduce administrative burden for our investigators and researchers. More clarity about different expectations about management plans that would be considered acceptable, and feeling like we're all on the same playing field and understanding what those expectations are, I think is a good thing. Of course, without our investigators accurately, completely reporting their relationships, none of the rest of it works, right? So we are going to be doing the best we can as we are reviewing our policies to make sure that we're providing the tools that are needed to make sure that folks understand what the requirements are, and that we can make that reporting as easy as possible. Do you have anything else to add? Hi.
In the world of sponsored clinical trial research, you often hear about these stories about residuals, exorbitant residuals going back to the PI or the department. Is that ever anything that falls on your radar as far as a potential source of conflict?
Do you mean residuals left over?
Right, after completion.
Jump in here, but I have seen some commentary when they're talking about broadening the definition of what they want to have reported. They're talking about moving to not just the direct payments, but the indirect payments. And so physicians, for example, listing who's sponsoring their research and those other kind of indirect financial relationships. And so, yes, I have seen movement in that direction. With some cancer, it's been at the cancer centers that I've seen at the forefront of that dialogue personally. But I think we'll see more attention in that area.
They'll be following the money, and so there's all these other potential areas to get caught up in, so to speak. But the one that I think is going to be the hardest is the conflict of interest with time, because that's one where you're going to have to define whether this is a significant amount of time that you're devoting outside of your work, and is that, how does that impact your study or your career? So that's, I think that's on the list there, but that's probably going to be the hardest one to capture. Money, it's easy, you can count. Okay, but I think time is going to be another potential one where we're going to have everyone kind of doing their own little standard first.
Lisa, I just wanted to remind our faculty and staff that our COI office is happy to come out and meet with them to help them update their disclosures on a monthly basis. Just call and we'll gladly assist.
Thank you.